So that's a really hard thing to discard an embryo or embryos. And it brings up big emotions. But if people are not clear on how they made that decision, it's likely to come back and haunt them a bit. So then my role would be, let's get clear. Let's get clear on why this is hard and it's the right thing for you. And we map that out. And so when you come back after you do it and you're feeling horrible, two things can be true. You can feel horrible and it can be the right thing. Getting an understanding of why that is will lead to the long-term peace with a really impossible decision.
Welcome to my fertility podcast, Superhumans, the show that brings you expert insights, personal stories, and the latest in fertility care all in one place.
Whether you're starting your fertility journey, navigating challenges, or just exploring your options, we're here to empower you with knowledge, support, and hope.
Join us as we dive deep into topics that matter most, from IVF and fertility treatments to mental health and wellness.
I'm Dr. Mavis Garcia.
And I'm Dr. Wise. We're two of the fertility specialists at Markham Fertility Centre in Markham, Ontario, Canada. Think of us as your sisters in all things fertility. Let's demystify the world of fertility together. On today's episode of My Fertility Podcast, we are joined by Dr. Rebecca Greenberg, who is both a nurse and bioethicist. Now, most of you may not consider or may not think about having an ethicist on this show, but hopefully by the end of our conversation, you will understand and appreciate what a unique role and perspective that a bioethicist can bring to the fertility discussions and fertility journey. Dr. Greenberg is the founder and principal consultant at Greenberg Consulting. She specializes in helping individuals and organizations navigate difficult decisions pertaining to healthcare. Dr. Greenberg is an adjunct professor in the Department of Paediatrics at the University of Toronto. She has a PhD and Post-doctoral Fellowship in Biomedical Ethics from the University of Toronto. She's worked at the Hospital for Sick Children, Mount Sinai Hospital, as a bioethicist. She is regarded as an absolute leader in the field, and she sits on the Bioethics Committees of the Canadian Paediatric Society and the Society of Obstetricians and Gynaecologists of Canada. She's also committed to education and sharing her research through speaking internationally, publishing research papers, and being featured in the media. Hopefully, you, the listener, will find this conversation as helpful and enlightening as we did.
Welcome, Rebecca. Please tell us a little bit about what you do and why you do what you do.
It's amazing to be here. I started my work in healthcare 20-something years ago as a bedside nurse. And during that time, I was really struck by how hard it is for patients and their families to make decisions that really have lifelong implications. So I went back to school and I ultimately got my PhD and postdoc in medical ethics, and then transitioned to a bioethicist where I focus on helping people make big decisions around their healthcare journey. And after working in downtown academic hospitals in Toronto for about 15 years, I decided to go into private practice. And in that, I really specialize in women's health and pediatrics. And, I find that in the fertility world, there are just so many decisions that patients have to make. And there is so much choice and opportunity, which is wonderful, but also can feel like a big burden when it's on them to decide which path I want to go down. So now I really focus on helping people make their decisions and also achieve long-term closure and minimize decisional regret. So when they come back and look at this period of time, that they're going to feel as settled as one can about how they decided to proceed.
That's great. Thank you so much. And thank you for being here. I think this episode is going to help a lot of people.
I would venture to say that probably most of our listeners and most fertility patients have never really thought about incorporating an ethicist into their, let's call it the care village, right?
Yeah.
The people that they surround themselves to help them. I mean, you've got maybe your fertility doctor, maybe naturopath, maybe acupuncturist, but I don't I don't think most people think about an ethicist necessarily. Can you tell us sort of what kind of situations or scenarios people might come to you with? And then what kind of would be your specific angle on things that would differ, let's say, from other people in that, I'm going to say, care village, let's say?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you're absolutely correct that we're a rare breed. And so most people are not familiar that we even exist or what it is that we can
Mm.
offer. In the context of the fertility world, there are lots of options. And in those circumstances, when an individual is unsure what is best for them, or a couple isn't in agreement or alignment with how to move forward, is usually where I enter the picture. So for those who are clear, okay, this is what I want to do, I don't really think that there is a role for a bioethicist. Usually, the longer people are in the fertility treatment process or the more options that get put on the table is often where I come into play. So, some examples might be a situation where a third party donor is proposed, whether it's sperm, egg, embryo, and the individual or the couple has to decide, are we ready to move there? Do we want to continue to try with our own biological samples, knowing that it won't likely be as effective? Or are we ready to move to the next step? When does one want to move to a gestational carrier? Is that something that's on the table? I see a number of couples who have been in treatments for many years, either because they've had a challenging go or they've had already one or two children through fertility treatments. And now the picture changes. So they're wondering, am I too old? What will this mean for our family? Sometimes one partner is really concerned about the toll that they know it'll take on the other. And so the stakes change. And so my role is to help people figure out, how do you move out of that point of uncertainty or conflict if you don't agree with the other? And you asked a great question, which is, so what is my approach or what is my framework? So I see myself as a neutral third party that's really akin to a decision making coach. So I don't come in and say, here's the right decision for you. I get to know the patients to really get a sense of what matters to them, what are their goals, what are the trade offs they're willing to make, what can they live with? What's going to bring them peace in the long run? And then through what matters to them, we work together to figure out what you should do and why you should do it. And the why is equally important because that really feeds into minimizing decisional regret. One last thing that's worth mentioning, I know you asked how I differ from other kind of healthcare providers, and I think that question usually is even narrowed down to the role of a psychologist or a social worker. So I don't do the implications counseling, and my role is not to focus on therapy, on processing perhaps the mental health piece or the emotional piece. Of course, you can't separate that, but my role is really discrete on, if you feel decisional paralysis and you're overwhelmed by the options, then I can help you focus on that and move forward to continue on with your journey.
That's really a very interesting point that's worth highlighting. It's not so much about processing the emotions, but it's that helping you come to those decisions and preventing that decisional regret. I think in my brain, that's very, very helpful to think about how these different pieces come together. I mean, I think about, us as physicians, as the fertility specialist, and then somebody may have a naturopath where we're both working to improve health, but through slightly different pathways. Is that kind of a fair way to think about it?
Yeah, and I see myself as part of the team. When I do take on clients, I am working with the care team and I do liaise with the physician to understand so that we have different pieces. I imagine both of you often hear the question, well, what would you do? How would you move forward, right? And that's usually a sign that they're looking for guidance because they're just overwhelmed with what's coming up. They are torn. They're trying to balance competing demands. Most people don't think about having a child through fertility treatments. So there is a piece of grief and sadness and need to depart from what they initially thought. And there's practical ramifications, and they don't know how to juggle that. So your job, right, is to explain the options and help figure out what makes sense from a medical perspective. But usually there's still choice. And that choice about what is right is so subjective. It based on not what would you do, but what is best for them, knowing who they are as a core human.
Yeah, I get that question a lot. What will you do? And especially because I've shared my fertility journey with my patients. But even though I have been through fertility and done IVF, it doesn't mean that, they should do what I would do, because we're all different people with different values and different risk tolerance and different situations. And I, as a physician, I do find it difficult sometimes to answer that question. And I bring it back to, like, if we're both going shopping, even if we have the same budget, we might choose different items and we might not even have the same budget. So then that might make a decision about what kind of items we choose. So it's just really hard. I usually use that example that, what I would do might be very different from what they would do in the same situation. It's really helpful to understand your role in decision making. Thank you so much for clarifying that. Now, I'm interested to understand from your experience and your perspective, what do you think is at the core of decision making? What makes decision making difficult? Because I'm thinking, let's say there is a patient who needs to have an egg donor. And yes, you're right, there would be grief because that's not the way they really thought they would have their family. There would be the questions of, is it the right thing for me? Can I afford the treatment? And all of those things. But that's not necessarily decision making conflict, it's just experiencing the emotions associated with the decision. So, what do you think is at the core of the decision paralysis or the difficulty in making the decision, other than the grief and the feelings associated with this?
I think at the core of the decision making paralysis is this misnomer that we need to have perfect certainty, that we can't have discomfort. Generally speaking, outside of this context, when discomfort in a situation comes up, it usually tells us it's not the right thing to do. For example, it doesn't feel good to lie. We feel uncomfortable lying, so we don't do it. But in this world, there is many situations where it may be the right thing to do and you feel uncomfortable. And so people are trying to get rid of that feeling of discomfort or ambivalence. And I would say that that is a barrier. So the first step is often saying, what is the role of this discomfort? Maybe this discomfort is actually helpful because it's allowing me to look at a fulsome picture, right? Like when I think about what is the process that's going to get you ultimately to the best decision, it's looking at everything. So discomfort in some way is your friend. And then to think about, well, how can I feel comfortable in a situation that's really foreign to me, that I've really never imagined, that I didn't wish for? And so working with couples and individuals to figure out what do they do with that discomfort and to shift from saying, I feel no dis-ease to saying, I've thought about things systematically and I can now look back at that in the future and say, here's how I got there. I think the other thing that causes a lot of discomfort is when we're working with couples. And there's a lot of alignment, of course, but there are times where people don't see things on the same page. And so then what? Not only are you trying to reconcile the decision, you're trying to reconcile and manage the relationship that is still going to be there, right?
Yeah, and I wonder, what are your thoughts? Because you're absolutely right about discomfort. And even outside of decision making, you're right. Discomfort is like a whisper that is telling you this isn't right. And we experience discomfort sometimes when people say things to us that are not aligned with our values, when to your example, we're asked to lie when maybe you're asked to, I don't know, dance and you don't like dancing, or drinking when you don't like drinking. And anytime that you're asked to do something that is not really aligned with your values, it's a message. But you're right, you also get discomfort in situations. Yesterday, I had to give a presentation and I was uncomfortable because it's not something that I do every day and I really wanted it to go well. But that's different. So, is there a tool to understand that this discomfort is just unfamiliarity with the thing, or is it really the message that you're like, no, no, I really need to listen to this? This is truly my soul letting me know this isn't right.
There's definitely tools and frameworks that I use and that I tell people to use. Before employing those, the first thing I would do is say, when you have that feeling, of course, one should pause and ask, why am I uncomfortable? Is this just a hard thing? I mean, these are hard times for a lot of people. What is the message here? And then, with respect to some of the tools, there was a decision making tool that was developed about 10 years ago, initially for the surgical context with elderly, called the best case, worst case scenario. And I find it's really helpful. Most people's minds tend to think in black and white or polarity. They think best case scenario, worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario can often cause us to feel stuck or overwhelmed. We often miss what is the most likely scenario. And so the best case, worst case tool really helps us flesh out and move away from what is most likely unrealistic, but where our brains usually go, best case and worst case. So, what is most likely? And then we move on to talk about risk threshold. So, if we then are able to say, well, of course, there's risk with most things, there's risks with driving on the highway or skiing downhill, right? There's risks, of course, with medical treatments, but what risk am I willing to live with? And if I have now changed my lens or my framework to be able to calculate that risk, is it going to be easier for me to move forward? That's one tool and one exercise that we work through. The other thing that I find is that these times in our lives can really tug on our identity. Who are we? A lot of people want to be a mom or a dad. And when they don't have that, it can really stir up a lot of things. Or they envisioned having a family that looked like X with this many children at this stage of life, spaced this far apart. And so I'm really interested in how we can hold onto our identity in a healthy way. And sometimes we need to shift, we need to reframe that. So, another thing that can be helpful for people is to write down, and if journaling is not for them, to even just think about, what is my story? What is the story that I want to have when I'm on the other side? And when I look back at this time in my life, almost what's a letter to myself? What are the things that I was thinking about? What matters to me? Why did I choose one thing or another? So, to really be writing to yourself for those moments where you're in your head and you're just looping around, what would you want to tell yourself in a kind, compassionate way? Can you write down what you would say to yourself in the future?
That's a really interesting idea for sure, because we have friends who are getting married soon. And I was thinking about people are you ready for marriage or ready to be with someone, in a couple? And fertility and fertility treatments never really come up. People don't really think about it as a couple. I mean, you try and have financial issues we might have, or health issues we might have. And very often, I think, when people and couples are faced with fertility issues, the first time where there may be a conflict or a bit of a disparity in terms of how people want to approach things. And it can be very jarring, actually, to hear your partner have a very different take or a different opinion. On the flip side, we also hear sometimes the partner who has a lot of ambivalence and who has no opinion, and who does very often the whatever you think is best. It's your body, whatever you want to do, it's up to you. And I can get that too. So for, let's say, a couple who is now kind of faced with these decisions where they runs the wide gamut of strong feelings versus this I don't know if it's ambivalence necessarily, but this like shunting of responsibility almost, or of like pushing it onto the other person. How can couples begin to navigate that? Like, how can you start to come to mutual conclusions together?
Yeah, I do see that a lot. And typically it tends to be towards the person who's carrying the child, the woman that be
Mhm.
carrying the child, this sense of what I think is well intended, which is, as you said, it's not my body, so I don't want to impose, or what's intended to be totally supportive. But then it can feel like such a burden when feels like it's on one person's shoulders, and they're worried about, is there going to be animosity in the future? Will this come back to haunt them in their relationship? And so I think it's really important to remember that decision making doesn't need to be 50-50. So when we think about partnerships, we often think about, well, we have to have equal roles in everything. But if we think about how relationships operate generally, we are stronger sometimes at one thing or do more of one thing, and then the other person picks it up. So I often encourage people to say, okay, this is intended to be helpful, but can we re-look at this dynamic and say, maybe it doesn't need to be a 50-50 in this circumstance, but what role can that partner be in that decision-making process? Can they be a sounding board? Can they share with you some of their worries or the things that they're excited about? And so it's finding a way that's going to fit for that couple and that dynamic, and moving away from this idea that we have to share evenly, but just be involved in different capacities. I think when there's conflict, there's some different tools and approaches that I might use.
If somebody is listening to this episode and they're in the middle of a decision paralysis or having a conflict with their partner or their family or somebody in their lives about the decision that they have to make, where do you think they should start?
Let's talk a little bit about the pitfalls in making decisions when you're working with a partner and you find yourself in conflict. Typically, what I see as the number one pitfall is this idea that somebody has to win the discussion, that they have to make all of their reasons the best reasons and the right reasons. And they try to discredit or invalidate the other's perspective. And we've all fallen into that trap in arguments with others, and it tends to just go circular, right? So when we're falling into the pitfall of this win-win dynamic, I say take a step back. And instead of looking at this as an opportunity to win, look at this as an opportunity to understand. So we don't all have to have the same reasons to make a decision. We just have to come together. And if we can come back and say, I'm present in this conversation, in this exchange to listen, to understand, not to be judge and jury, I find that conversations can take completely different shape and people can identify the common ground, because that's where they're going to be able to move forward. It's okay to have things that we don't agree on. It's okay to see things differently, but we have to find that commonality, which becomes really hard to do in the win-win dynamic. The second pitfall I see is when there is conflict and the focus is just, we have to make a decision. Time is ticking. I'm not getting younger. We said we were going to do this transfer. I mean, you can probably think of so many different scenarios. We just have to make the decision. And that's true, but it's actually unhelpful because they're missing so much of the important discourse or the process to get there. So I mentioned earlier in our conversation that it's not just about what is the decision, but the why. So taking a step back on, how did we get here? Why did we want kids in the first place? What were we hoping for? What are our big goals, broadly speaking? And to talk about the reasons, the whys, and what were the parts along the way that we agreed with, right? Trying to find sort of concentric circles, if you will, the points of overlap, and just be open to there can be things that we don't agree with. And then what tends to happen is once the why becomes shared and aligned, then the decision's going to follow, and we're going to reduce the likelihood of future animosity towards another partner.
Yeah, that's so true. That future animosity and the sort of like looking back, it's animosity towards yourself in the future and also towards your partner or with your partner as well. And it's so important to think about that. It's helpful to really have a framework in terms of how to get there because conflict with partners is hard. We all get a little emotional. We all get a little bit stuck in sort of old communication patterns whenever that comes up for sure. If somebody was listening to this and thinking, you know what, this sounds really interesting, what does it look like for patients to work with you? How does it go, I guess?
Yeah, for sure. When there's conflict, I think this is an opportunity where it is helpful to have a neutral third party facilitate a conversation and create boundaries, and sort of a container for a constructive dialogue. So, what it looks like to work with me is on average, it's 2 to 3 sessions. I work virtually, so I see patients across the country. And the first session, which is 80 minutes, is really focused on understanding their story and what are their concerns, what are they hoping for, and seeking out alignment between perspectives from the parties involved. Or if it's one person who's making a decision on their own, helping them reconcile where they're having internal conflict or turmoil. And I referenced the best case, worst case tool earlier. We work through that to help people really think about what is most likely. I think most people don't usually sit in that scenario. And so pushing them to think about things that perhaps they haven't thought about is where we start. And then there's typically 1 or 2 follow-up sessions that are 50 minutes where we then begin to explore the options and then circle down on a way forward.
Going back, Rebecca, to the first part of this conversation, you very clearly talked about the difference between working with a medical ethicist like yourself and working with a psychologist or a counselor. I want to provide you with some scenarios, and I would like you to tell me if this would be a scenario where it would be helpful to work with one or the other or with both. So some of the scenarios we're thinking about would be, let's say a couple who has embryos available. They would love to have more children, but medical issues, financial life, they just don't feel like it would be a wise decision for their family to transfer the embryos with a chance of a pregnancy. And now they have to discard the embryos. But back to the discomfort, there is a lot of grief, anxiety, discomfort, strong emotions, to the point that I felt at the time that, I guess, of course, we'll do what you want, but I really wanted them to process this before they go through with the discarding of the embryos, because even though it wasn't a conflict per se, they've made the decision together and they felt it was the right thing for the family. There was very, very strong emotions that I felt it was a little bit more than grief. That would be one scenario. And another scenario would be a situation where one person wants to transfer an embryo for a baby and the other partner does not. And this is hard because you cannot do half a baby. So, there is no compromising there. And let's say one person feels strongly about destroying embryos, like I would never do that. And the other person is say, we're done, our family is complete, and I do not want to have any more children together. And again, a lot of emotions, a lot of grief, a lot of conversations around that. Tell me what you think of those scenarios.
It's kind of fun. This is like a little trivia, ask the ethicist. So the first scenario, what I'm gathering in these kinds of scenarios is, as you mentioned, there's just a tremendous amount of emotion to process: grief, sadness, loss. And there may be, for some women, mental health pieces also at play. When a decision's already been made and the primary presenting issue is the processing of emotions, that would be outside of my scope. And that would be when I would refer to a therapist or a counselor of some sort. But in the second scenario, there is that sense of disagreement where people are not on the same page. And that is a classic situation where people come to me to work that out, to find a way to move forward on the same page. Sometimes I even have couples that fit into the scenario that was described earlier, where it's, I'm going to let my wife make this choice. And sometimes I hear, I don't want another. I'm done, or I think it's not a good idea for reasons X, Y, and Z, but I'll let you make the decision. And then what? So even in a situation where there may not be overt conflict, but they don't see things perfectly, they reach out because that's not a comfortable place to be. And most people don't want to hold the reins knowing where there's discomfort. I might backtrack to the first scenario and say, if someone's made a decision, but they're not sure why, then there is a role, right? The role on helping them process, okay, so that's a really hard thing to discard an embryo or embryos, and it brings up big emotions. But if people are not clear on how they made that decision, it's likely to come back and haunt them a bit. So then my role would be, let's get clear. Let's get clear on why this is hard and it's the right thing for you. And we map that out. And so when you come back after you do it and you're feeling horrible, two things can be true. You can feel horrible and it can be the right thing. Getting an understanding of why that is will lead to the long-term peace with a really impossible decision.
Thank you for saying that, because I have these conversations all the time, and sometimes the patients are sure and I don't sense any issues, and then we proceed with their wishes, like their wishes always. But sometimes as a physician, I'm just thinking, oh, like there's something here and I can't put my finger on it. So thank you for saying that. Because sometimes my patients say, oh, am I a horrible person for doing this? I can't believe that after in my journey, I have to do this. This feels like heart-wrenching and I must be a horrible person. Then that's what makes me think, well, I think there is something more to explore here, because I never want my patients at the end of this journey going into that last chapter feeling quote unquote like a horrible person. So I think there is a role there for people who are thinking, yeah, this is the right decision, but it still feels not great, like not something that I could ever do or bring myself to do or that I thought that I would do. And that's not uncommon for people that have gone through the fertility journey and have hope and pray for these embryos, and they find themselves in a situation where their journey is ending and they have to discard. And I would say most people will welcome more children. It's just not possible for many reasons for them to grow their family. So I'm glad to know that there is a role besides just the grief. There is a role for saying, like, what are my values and how can I live comfortably within my values, and know that this decision is actually aligned with my values, even though it's a hard one to make.
Yeah. And I think that what happens when there is that discomfort is people go back to the decision and then they second guess themselves. We work through having a plan. When you feel that discomfort, what is that discomfort telling you? And I'll say it again because I think it's worth repeating. Something can be hard and uncomfortable and still be appropriate and be the right course. These are hard, uncomfortable scenarios. Of course, there's the amazing wish at the end for a child in most of the circumstances, or to close that chapter or talking about discarding embryos and moving on. So helping people reconcile that so that it doesn't cause tremendous disruption to them emotionally as time goes on.
Another really challenging situation, both for myself as the fertility physician and for patients, is when to stop and when to stop active treatment, let's call it, when it's stopping doing more IVFs, more transfers, more whatever. And that's a really, really hard, because that's often where I think the question comes up of like, oh, what would you do if you were me? Or that's the one where I hear it. That one I really struggle to answer and to kind of talk about Because even in the vast majority of situations, the chance of success is never not zero, right? If you do one more cycle, there's always that possibility, one more cycle. And then you can always find somebody on social media or in your circle who's done just that one more IVF, and that was the one that worked, right? And trying to manage hope for the person if they do proceed, but then also trying to be realistic, but then also trying to give people this idea that, you can stop, right? That it is a reasonable option. And so I also feel like that would be a really great scenario where someone could benefit from both somebody processing the emotional part, the grief, the loss, all the emotions, and being able to come to that decision in a way where you can look back 10, 15, 20 years and be comfortable with it, I guess. Do you find that you see a lot of people for that?
Yeah, that's a big part of my practice. My husband and I went through treatment ourselves, and I have to say that determining when to stop was probably the hardest decision. And I have a number
Mhm.
of clients that come to me with that. It's something that's not talked about early. And I think part of the
Mhm.
reason that that is the case is with the best of intention, we don't want to take away hope. It's a really important that people feel hopeful and that what they're doing is appropriate. And so then it comes up at a later date where people have not really thought about it. And often there is this misunderstanding that more is better, more is more. But there is a point in time where more is actually harmful, that one can want to be a parent and also want to have other things in their lives. And so that conversation looks at transitioning to what is it that they're hoping for? And it doesn't discredit their story or their experience to date. Or some people worry that it's going to give the impression that they never really wanted this, right? I think that that's an unhelpful way to look at it. It's okay, so where do we go from here? What is it that we're hoping for now? And I think that there's this construct of the fertility warrior because it's so hard. And that's helpful to get through because when you look back and say, "Oh my god, like look what I've been through." It is like being a warrior, but then it butts up against this idea of stopping. So then, well, what are you a warrior for? Are you a warrior for quality of life, for a healthy relationship with others and yourself? And so we can find ways to remap what it is that they want. So definitely an area where I see a lot of people reaching out.
I gotta ask, do you have a sense of when that conversation should come up? How do you balance that? I don't know. Do you have a feeling about that?
So I think when it starts to come up is when we see that the risks and benefits are changing, when the efficacy is going down, when people, and we haven't gotten into this, but as people age through their process and that brings other considerations that is tied to efficacy, etc., that I think that those are the times where we should bring it up. Because usually when we start, the framework for how we're evaluating risks and benefits and the chance of success is going to be different at a future date. So as that changes, or there's multiple failed attempts, I think then it's a conversation. And I've mentioned this idea that two things can be true. So we can still be hopeful and still continue on with treatments and also say that there may come, right? That's the operative word here is may. There may be a point in time where this is going to come up. And I'm mentioning it now, not because I think we're there yet, but because when and if that happens, that's a hard thing. And it's not great to come up as a surprise at the very end. It's helpful just to, it's planting a seed to say, hopefully we don't get there, but if we do, I want to equip you for that.
That's definitely a tough conversation to have. I've been doing this for many years now, and I have to admit it's still difficult because people usually come to the appointment hoping that you have a plan for them, hoping that you have like the next steps. And it's always hard to say, well, these are all the things we can do next. And have you thought about this other option? Yeah, it's so hard. You're right. And it's hard for them to stop because then they feel like they're quitting. And of course, the internet is full of stories of like, I did all of these things and now look at me, happy, and you could do it too. And you shouldn't give up. And there is this negative connotation to giving up. And it's hard for the fertility specialists because we are the ones, I mean, our job is to get them to success. So it is definitely a difficult conversation. And when I've had it, usually it's because they have brought it up and then I have shown support and say, congratulations. And there is so much more to life that you can do. But it's hard for me to bring it up when it's not coming from them.
For sure. I think this is tied to a sense of failure and disappointment for everybody, the physicians, the team, and certainly the patients. I like to talk about, what is the story that you're telling yourself? Can you tell yourself that you tried? That'll be easier to live with long term, knowing that you did everything that you could. And then how do we think about how we don't want to fail ourselves as humans that are multifaceted? Of course, for so many of us, being a parent is a huge part of our identity, or the desire to be a parent is a huge part of our identity. And there are also other pieces. And so when the longer people go on with lack of success, the other parts of their identity begin to erode. They begin to bear the consequences of the lack of success. And so if we can reframe it from saying it's a failure to saying, I choose happiness, I choose quality of life. Do I want to live waiting for the 2% chance? Or am I able to move forward in some way? And I actually have heard from my clients that when their provider does ultimately raise that conversation, they feel a sense of validation because they're thinking about it, but they're looking for permission to say, it's okay. You are still strong. You are still amazing. You are still that warrior, right? And they're like looking for that permission.
Yes. I have to say, there's two tools that you mentioned that really resonated with me because I've used them in my life for everything, all decisions and all hard things, from a little bit hard to a lot hard. And those are the story that you tell yourself and the future, thinking about your future self, either, what letter will you send to your future, how you want your future self to think about this situation. And like I said, I use it for the tiny little hard things, like I don't really want to go to the gym, but I should. And then I think about like, okay, what's my story? Who am I? And what does my future self want from me right now? That really gets me to the gym really quickly when I think about that. And for the harder things in lives like family and career and big decisions like that as well. I think those tools can be really useful. And I know I did a lot of those tools when I was going through my journey because I had my first baby with IVF, and then there was a period about 4 years where I kept trying to have a second and I couldn't. I was almost 40 at the time and I had to start thinking about, do I stop? I ended up doing one more cycle and that was my son. But I had to start toying with that idea of like, what is my story? What am I choosing? When do I stop? When does it end? Can I have a life different from what I envision? Can I find happiness in other things? So yeah, those tools I think are very valuable and very useful.
I imagine that for a lot of patients, even when they're sitting down for the first time, or maybe not the first time, but when they're sitting down with their provider and they're thinking about, okay, do we plunge into IVF? Do we do IUI? Do we do this? I think many people may potentially toy with the idea of not doing any fertility treatment, which is just completely reasonable. Fertility treatment is not something that anybody has to do. It's really very, very, very much patient-led, which is what makes it very unique in the world of medicine. And I really hope that people, even at the start of their fertility journeys, will listen to this conversation. And I'm really hoping that this podcast episode will plant the seed into their mind of being like, you know what? It's okay not to do the thing, or it's okay to say, you know what, I'm going to do one IVF and then that's it, right? And to plan ahead. And I'm thinking about ways that I can incorporate this when I'm talking with patients. How can I frame that to patients, I guess, in that initial conversations?
So that's a great question. And it's worth mentioning that there's literature across the different disciplines and fields of medicine that say when something's put on the table, it is perceived as a strong recommendation, even in the context of a clinician saying, I don't think you need to do this, but here's what it could look like. And usually what we know from the literature, from research, the most invasive, intense recommendation is usually seen to be the best. So let's come back to your question about how do you manage this at the outset and how is this relevant for people who are starting? I often say that just because you can doesn't mean that you should. It's, it is odd distinction in philosophy. I'm not going to go too far down that rabbit hole and bore people, but, I think part of the conversation is to say, we're going to discuss options. And I want you to know that just because I put something out on the table doesn't mean that it's right or best. And the option of not doing anything is also on the table. So I think it's framing it so that people recognize and naming it out loud. Just because something is on the table doesn't mean you need to do it, doesn't mean that it's the best. It's one option. And then the question that they have to ask themselves is, how do the options align with what matters to them?
That's a really good practical point that I'm going to take away from this conversation. It's discussing all the options on the table, saying that you don't have to do the thing, and then including the not doing the active treatment. Maybe it should be on the table from the very, very beginning so that it becomes easier to talk about it, with each passing conversation if you've already mentioned it a couple of times. Thank you for that.
I want to ask you one last question to close this episode, which would be for anybody listening and struggling, do you have final parting words or words of wisdom or something that you want to leave our audience with?
I would say approach your decisions from a place of non-judgmentalness and allow yourself the opportunity to make space to feel uncomfortable. We learned from the field of psychology that the more you push something away, discomfort is what we're talking about, I think, a lot in this conversation, the bigger it grows. But when we make space to normalize the range of hard emotions, we will expend less psychological energy. And when we are not expending energy into the emotion, then the decision becomes more clear because we're able to think more rationally. So just to recap, go into this non-judgmentally, and whatever emotions or hard things come up, make space for them. They're not necessarily bad. They're part of your story, and they're part of your roadmap to ultimately getting you to a decision that's best for you.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being here, Rebecca. I think that is excellent advice, not just for anybody who is struggling with infertility, but any struggle, any conflict, any time when people are finding themselves at odds with a decision that they have to make. I think that's very helpful advice.
It's been great chatting. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. As I said at the outset of this conversation, very few patients in this space would think about having an ethicist or making use of an ethicist. But I think at the end of this conversation, I suspect a lot of people are going to realize, like, oh yeah, that may be exactly the person that I need. And so you're going to reach a lot of people, and you're going to help a lot of people, and you're going to inspire people to reach out. And that's a wrap for today, Superhumans.
If you're looking to connect, get social with us. Follow us on YouTube and Instagram at My Fertility Podcast, or visit us online at myconfertility.com. And don't forget, follow, subscribe, and share your favorite episode.
Thanks for listening to My Fertility Podcast and for being a vital part of our community. We know you've got this.
We're signing off until next Tuesday.
If you found this episode of My Fertility Podcast helpful, please take a moment to head over to the review section and leave us your thoughts. Your reviews and comments are incredibly valuable to us and help guide future episodes. We also welcome you to direct your questions to info@myfertilitypodcast.com.
My Fertility Podcast is produced by Rabbit Media, Inc. in conjunction with Dr. Garcia and Dr. Weiss.
Music from Mixkit, Life is a Dream by Michael Ramir C.
My Fertility Podcast is not intended to replace any type or variation thereof professional medical, health, or legal advice. nor should the content be taken as medical advice. Please contact your primary healthcare professional regarding any medical questions you may have. The information presented in this podcast is based on the knowledge and understanding of the host at the time of recording. Medical knowledge is constantly evolving, and new research may change the understanding of health-related topics. While we strive to provide accurate and up-to-date information, we do not guarantee the completeness, accuracy, or timeliness of the content. The views expressed in this podcast by guests are not those of the host or the management. This podcast is not intended to impose any type of discrimination. My Fertility Podcast and its management are not responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from the use of this podcast.